Good to see you all. I can't really say this is our new office anymore because we've been here a year. But actually, it's the first event that I've hosted here. And it's one that I really enjoy doing, which is the Reuters Institute Digital News Report. I mean, if you can believe it, this is the Rasmus 13th year. 47 countries this year, so it's basically half of the world. And in many respects, I think it's probably the best global report that explains digital news and media consumption habits. So it's good to be here. It's good to have all of you here. We've got a terrific panel that we're going to get to in a minute. I'll introduce them. As you hear from Rasmus and then Nick Newman, who is the lead author, or one of the lead authors, have a think about what you might want to ask of the panel. You know who's on it. I'll do the formal introductions, as I say, shortly. But have a think about what you want to ask. We'll get to questions from the audience and from those online as well, as this is a hybrid event. So with that, Rasmus, he's here with his Labour tie, but he did tell me he's been wearing that for the last 10 years. So that is incredible foresight from Rasmus. But Rasmus, if you could come up and make an introduction, and then I think you're going to hand over to Nick. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ed. I should stress, in line with the trust principles of independence, integrity, and freedom from bias, it is a red tie. So it's a real pleasure to have this event together with our partners at Edelman. Thanks to Ed and to Joe for their many years of support for the Digital News Report. As Ed says, this is the largest ongoing study of news and media use across the world. We cover 47 markets on 6 continents, together accounting for more than half of the world's population. This really comes alive in conversations with people like you who are trying to navigate the environment that we are analyzing. I will simply say a few things about how it's possible, and then Nick will present key findings from this year's report, and then, as Ed says, it'll really come alive in the conversation with our panelists and with you. The Digital News Report is based on an online survey. That means that in majority world markets that we cover, this will underrepresent the habits and preferences of those who don't have access to the internet. These are typically less privileged parts of the population, older people, poor people, people who live far away from the big urban centers. But in the UK and other high-income countries, these are nationally representative samples of the adult population. The study is made possible by 19 different funders. The Google News Initiative is the main funder of the Digital News Report. We're also privileged to be supported by the BBC, our namesakes at Reuters, universities, foundations, media regulators, and the long-running partnership with Edelman. So I am simply here to say welcome and thank you for coming out, those who are online as well, and hand it over to Nick, who will deliver the real findings this year. Thank you.
Thanks, Rasmus. Good morning, everybody. It's really good to be with you. I'm going to start the data part of this with these very significant changes that we're seeing within the platform environment. So this is partly linked to new technology, to AI. It's partly just the changing strategies of tech companies. And it's also partly changing audience behavior. But we're really starting to see this affecting the news industry. And the most obvious example of this is what's happening with Facebook, where we see a very significant decline in weekly use for finding, sharing, consuming news on the platform. And this, of course, is part of a deliberate strategy from Facebook to pull back from news, to pull back from politics, and invest in content that it sees as being more engaging for its users, including investing more in individual creators and pulling back from supporting some publishers. So this is aggregate data for a number of the social media and video platforms from 12 markets we've been following for some time. And the other big trend you can see here is the very sharp growth over the last few years in video networks or visually led networks. So YouTube, Instagram, TikTok. This is really where we're seeing the growth right now. And I should also say that Facebook and X are also leaning into video and prioritizing formats that are designed to keep people within those platforms. So the sort of post and refer model that has sustained traditional media for some time and media's depended on is being severely diminished even before you get to the threat of what might happen with AI-driven search. So this chart represents 12 mostly Western countries, but actually we see these shifts really moving even faster elsewhere. Specifically, if you look at the use of TikTok for news, which is the fastest growing social network for news, we see the real growth in countries outside Western Europe. So, for example, in Kenya, was it last week, the week before, you had these riots around the parliament. Much of that was driven ground up from TikTok and YouTube. It also played a significant role in recent elections in the EU, in particular in enabling politicians like Jordan Bardella to connect with young people, and indeed in our own election as well, we've seen that. If you look at the numbers, though, in the UK, the average number is still pretty small, but of course, much more with younger people, and that's really the change we've seen as TikTok becoming more of a news network. If we look at YouTube consumption, this is, of course, much higher than TikTok overall, so 31% across all of our markets say they use YouTube for news weekly. But again, a similar disproportionate usage in the global south, and again, much more important with younger people. And then picking up on a theme that actually we talked about last year, we find within these video networks in particular, it's proving much harder for traditional media companies to cut through in a way that maybe they did in a Facebook or Twitter era. And this year we asked people to name some of the accounts that they followed most regularly. And these are just some of the young news creators that they talked about. So in France, you have Hugo Decrypt, or Hugo Travers is his real name. He does explainers. He's really the go-to person for under 30s in France, we found. So in our data, his name came up more often than Le Monde, Libération, or the major TV networks, and not just with young people. TLDR News with Jack Kelly, who is going to be on the panel, really, again, resonating with young people, with explainer content around politics. On the right, you have Vita Spihar, who runs a TikTok account in the US called Under the Desk News. So they present the news from under the desk in this informal way, rather than the sort of traditional over-the-desk formality of traditional television news. But of course, it's not just about short-form video, and it's not just about young people. We also find some very well-known and often outspoken personalities building audience for long-form video content via these online platforms. So you may have seen Tucker Carlson now setting up on his own. 200 million views, was it, for the interview with Vladimir Putin on X alone, another 34 million on YouTube, along with a whole load of partisan voices. In the UK, it tends to be more traditional news correspondents, we find, and anchors who are also resonating in these networks, though Piers Morgan, of course, has now left Talk TV and is setting up on his own as an online news creator. We also have podcasters. So podcasts used to be audio, and now you have Alistair Campbell and Rory Stewart finding new audience with visualized podcasts and also moving back into television. So we have a detailed chapter on the role of influencers in video networks in the report looking at 6 countries. So these are some of the reasons why people say they like long-form and short-form video. So firstly, the sense of authenticity, that it is people who are coming from an authentic position, for example, videos directly from Gaza, without the spin and the agendas of traditional media. This is one of the reasons they say they enjoy it. Convenience, so the format is really short, it's really easy to consume, but also the algorithm is tailored to your personal interests. And then finally, the range of perspectives that you can get in these platforms. It's bringing together a much wider definition of news than we've traditionally found in media companies. So this year we're seeing or have seen a record number of elections around the world, including here in the UK. They come at a time of rising concern about misinformation of various kinds, including AI-generated fakes. And overall, across our countries, we find a 59% say that they are worried about their ability to tell what is real from what is false on the internet when it comes to news, and that is up for the second year in a row. And we also find that some of the biggest numbers and some of the biggest increases are in countries which have held or are holding elections, such as the US, South Africa, India, but it's also much higher in the UK than in many other countries. And this comes as many online platforms are being affected by AI images, deepfake videos, which has become much more realistic over the last year, much more photorealistic, and therefore harder to tell the difference. And in our qualitative research this year, which we did in 3 countries, we found a number of people, particularly heavy social media users, who are increasingly coming across these. If you go into TikTok, you'll see a huge amount of synthetic content just in the last few months. And they worry about where this might be heading and what it might mean. So up until now, we've always parsed text and looked for agendas in text, but when it comes to pictures and video, we've always been able to rely on that. I think going forward, that's not necessarily going to be the case. So in that regard, for the first time this year, we asked about specific platforms and the extent to which people found it difficult or easy to distinguish trustworthy news from untrustworthy news. Consistently across countries, we find that TikTok and X are the networks where users of each platform worry most about their ability to tell what's true or not. And these are networks where we are seeing more of that sort of synthetic content, and where content moderation, of course, is not as well developed as some of the other networks. In this year's report, we've also looked at how the news industry is incorporating artificial intelligence, emerging public attitudes to AI in the news more widely. So in the survey, we asked people about 2 different scenarios. So firstly, how comfortable people were with content that was mainly produced by the AI with some human oversight. So an example might be an AI bot that writes a story or maybe gives a response to a query. And in general, what we see here is high levels of discomfort. So a bit more comfortable in the US than the UK, perhaps linked to high awareness and usage in the US, but also more discomfort around hard news topics like politics or international news. The second scenario is where the humans remain in charge of the content, but AI is doing the supportive role in the background. So that might be doing research, it might be doing transcription, translation, some of these tasks. And here we see a very different story. So both in the US and the UK, we find that the majority of people are more comfortable than uncomfortable with humans remaining in the loop. Though it's also worth noting that there are a lot of people who don't yet have an opinion, so it's still very early days when it comes to AI. So all of this talk to AI brings us inevitably to the question of trust, where the headline figure has actually remained across all countries pretty stable this year. So 40% say they trust most news most of the time. It's a little bit lower in the UK. But this year we asked our respondents to tell us which factors were most important in defining which news outlet to trust or not to trust. And these results may be not surprising, but they're also very clear and consistent across countries, across age groups. People expect the media to have high standards of accuracy and also ethical standards. They expect the media to be transparent and open, to be, as far as possible, to be unbiased, or at least to be open about biases, not to exaggerate or sensationalize, and finally to be fair in coverage of different groups. So these 5 factors essentially are the factors that people care about the most. And if people say there is low trust in a media system, it's broadly because they feel that these factors are not being met, they're not happening. So if publishers want to improve trust, it's about persuading the public that these principles are being adhered to. So many media companies right now are doubling down on one of these, which is this idea of transparency and openness, being more open about the workings, if you like. So brands or sub-brands like BBC Verify. Our data suggests this does go down quite well with people who are already trusting of the news, but less well with those who are skeptical or distrusting of your output. So there's obviously a danger of sort of backfiring in that case, and we see lower scores with those groups. So beyond trust, one of the key challenges for commercial media is how to get more people to pay for online news, especially given the recent unpredictability in the advertising market. So every year, we track the proportion in different countries that pay for online news through either subscription or membership or donation. And what we see here in this slide is the highest proportion paying for news in Nordic countries like Norway, 40%, Sweden, 31%. Healthy levels of payment too in the US, 22%. And then at the bottom there, you see the United Kingdom, just 8%. So overall, the average of these countries is unchanged for the last 3 years, so 17% across these 20 countries. So what we see is broadly, we've seen growth over a number of years, but that seems to be leveling off. As in previous years, we find a few big, more upmarket brands taking a very significant share of that subscription pie. So the New York Times, for example, in our data accounts for around 40% of all subscribers in the US. Along with the Atlantic and some of the bundled combinations. And those all-access bundles have helped it extend its lead over some of the other providers. Here in the UK, it's a bit more split, with the Telegraph, Times, and the Guardian as the three leading paid content brands, though we also find some pretty heavy discounting from some of those brands in our data as well. And then we're seeing, we see growth in lower cost niche subscriptions where sort of individuals or smaller companies are really providing value in a specific area, whether that's local news or particular verticals. So the final challenge is one we've talked about for a few years, and it's the evidence that some people are increasingly turning away from the news and from politics. So this year, this is a question we ask about to what extent are you interested or very interested in news? We've asked it in this question the same way for the last, since 2015. And what you can see here in the UK is that number's gone down from 70% in 2015 to just 38%. So this may be that people's definition of news has slightly changed, or it may be that decline in, some of the decline has happened since COVID. In particular, you can see that rather dramatic change in many of these lines. It's not the case in every country, so this is not universal. It's happening more in countries that have more polarized politics and some of the larger countries in our survey. And then beyond that, we have this concept of selective news avoidance. So these are people who are consuming the news, but also say that they sometimes or often avoid it. So that may be they're consuming news less often, or they're avoiding particular subjects. And part of the reason for that is people find the news negative, consistently negative. Here's a quote, how are we supposed to function when all we see are the bad things in life? Or they feel that they are powerless in the face of these enormous global challenges. I think the other aspect is a question about people feeling overloaded by the amount of news and this sort of sheer volume of information. And again, we see the numbers for news overload increasing over the last few years. So finally, we looked in the report about what we might do about some of these problems of news avoidance and low interest, and how well the media might address specific user needs. And part of this is based on a model of user needs that the BBC developed a few years ago. And we asked how well the media is doing against updating types of stories, educating stories which are more about backgrounders, engagement, or perspective. And what we find is the media is seen to be doing a really good job in creating up-to-date news, but less good potentially in stories that inspire or connect or give perspective. So maybe there's some gaps here which the panel can discuss. So just finally, 5 key points, just a reminder as we set up the discussion. So in terms of the online platform reset, some platforms withdrawing from news, we have that increase in video formats, we have AI in the news, subscription growth stalling, and then finally, opportunities for more engaging products. And it'd be interesting to hear how the panel reacts. Thank you.
to me. So we will, Nick, try to inspire, we'll try to connect, and we'll give some perspective, as your slide clearly demands, with 4 trusted news players from 4 trusted news organisations. So to my left, I've got Samantha Discerner-Yerker, who's the executive news editor for BBC Digital Output. You oversee international digital news teams, 20 years as we established, a bit longer than me at the BBC, extensive experience in digital news, and I think quite involved in the UK election coverage as well.
Yes, come off a series of overnights.
Excellent. Right, we've got Kathy Newman, many of you will know, presenter of Channel 4 News and investigations editor, known for her brilliant investigative reporting. She regularly presents Channel 4's Dispatches, which recently, I'm sure some of you saw, ran an experiment around the use of AI deep fakes to influence voter behaviour. Fascinated to hear about that experiment that happened earlier in the year when we talk. We've also got, as Nick said, Jack Kelly. He's the CEO and founder of TLDR News, which creates digital content to help young people understand the world around them. You've got 3 million subscribers, primarily 16 to 35-year-olds. If you want to get to young audiences, Jack is your man. I would encourage you to watch an interview he did at a NATO summit recently with one of the deputy sec-gens, which was an excellent piece of sort of explanatory journalism in many ways. And then finally, Matt Garahan, part of the furniture at the Financial Times, I would say. I think of him, well, I think of you, Matt, as like an Eames chair in terms of part of the furniture. He's the FT's current head of digital platforms. He's a former global media editor, columnist on media and technology. He's led the coverage of major global events, now based in the UK, but for many years in New York. Okay, why don't we start with this topic of misinformation, disinformation, reliable information. Look, many of you have been reporting on this year's elections. We've got, I think, pretty much half of all democracies going to the polls. And at the same time, we see rising geopolitical tensions, the increasing use of dis and misinformation campaigns to shape public opinion. And as Nick pointed out, 6 in 10 people are concerned about their ability to distinguish fake news from real news. Kathy, can I come to you first? In the Channel 4 newsroom, how are you tackling this kind of misinformation challenge? How you think, when all the news is coming into your input desk, how are you thinking about distinguishing between what is real and what is fake at the moment?
I mean, it's getting harder and harder, which is what we were trying to prove with our experiment on dispatches. And, you know, unfortunately or fortunately, depending on your perspective, it did prove exactly what we suspected it might, that people are struggling to discern the difference. So just to digress into that experiment, if I may, for a second, 12 households of undecided voters, and we tried to sort of push them one way or the other to vote one way or the other by giving them a mix of genuine news information, but also some fakes and hot mic moments and deep fakes that we had ourselves created. And we pretty much pushed them all to vote the way we wanted them to vote. So that sort of showed to us how hard it is to distinguish. You know, these were not stupid people. These were ordinary people who could not tell the difference between the real news and the fake news. So to come back to your question, in the newsroom, it's getting harder than ever to discern. And you, Nick, in your presentation, you popped up a picture there, a couple of pictures of fakes. And, you know, if you're looking at it with the benefit of hindsight, you can see that they were obvious fakes. But these things are getting better and better, particularly the hot mic moments. Yeah. You know, we had one of those, a couple of them actually, with Wes Streeting in the election. His majority ended up being just over 500. I mean, who knows if some of those fake hot mic moments persuaded people to change their vote? We don't know. But in the newsroom, we're having to be ever more alert. We're having to be pile resources into fact-checking, which, you know, is part of the bread and butter of journalism, of course. Yeah. But, you know, it is becoming ever more resource-intensive. You know, we have an excellent fact-check team, and at the BBC, BBC Verify is excellent. So we're putting a lot of effort into that. And I suppose the question, you know, for all of us in this room is, how do we ensure that public service broadcasting content and reputable content is prioritised on platforms so that we have, we are giving people the right information, the trusted information on which they can base their decisions. Otherwise, the sort of implications for democracy and for society are pretty scary if we're not able to do that.
Well, I'll come to Samantha actually representing the BBC point of view on this in a second. But before I do that, Kathy, how does it feel when you're on the receiving end of being accused of producing fake news? Obviously, there was a lot of there were a lot of attack lines coming out of Reform UK about Channel 4's investigation into Reform activists.
Yeah, I mean, that was obviously a very highly charged moment in the campaign. We, right from the off, vigorously stood by our investigation. It was a rigorously handled investigation. And I think the important thing was that Ofcom turned around its investigation very quickly and endorsed 100% our journalism. So that was clearly important. But, we're at the sharp end. And unfortunately, this has been the case for me personally for several years.
Yes, I know.
I'm right from... I remember coming back from maternity leave many years ago, because my youngest is now 15. But, and just sort of wandering into this whole world of Twitter, and which was new at the time, and thinking, wow, this is incredible, isn't it? And it wasn't that long before I got embroiled in, death threats and all sorts of shit being poured over my head. And that was a kind of early reality check. And I think now we're sort of inured to this, and you just have to hold very firm in the face of these attacks, and you have to double down, as I was saying before, on fact-checking, rigorous journalism, investigations. And I suppose that's why, I believe passionately in public service broadcasting. And Channel 4, with the I won't say demise of Newsnight, but sort of downgrading of Newsnight, Channel 4 News is the last remaining bastion of, intensive, an hour-long, every night programme that delves into some of these issues. And so I think that's incredibly important to protect. I mean, I would say that.
And it is quite clear that there are various actors around the world who are intent on undermining news institutions for a variety of reasons.
And it was right. It was out of the Trumpian playbook, wasn't it? The way Reform sort of handled that investigation, and right down to the press conference the day after the election, where I was lucky enough to get a question to Nigel Farage, but he immediately turned his fire on us, the stitch-up merchants, he called us.
It is out of the playbook. Samantha, so BBC News still consumed by more people in this country than I think any other news provider. Can you talk about the kind of technical aspect? You're sitting in the newsroom. The world is an incredibly complicated place. Its issues are highly contentious and contested. How is BBC News thinking about managing this kind of issue of disinformation so that you're not duped?
I mean, it's really interesting you mentioned Wes Streeting. So I'll start with that and then I'll kind of tackle the meat. And I think the thing that was so interesting about that Wes Streeting moment was obviously the fake itself, but also, and Mariana Spring has written about this, the life that took on online. So it's not just the product itself that is created. It's the fact that it's shared, and then what looks like quite authentic comments and quite authentic kind of responses. And there's sort of two aspects to the tackling of the myths and disinformation. There's being able to identify and cut them down at source and, call that out. But then it's also about engaging and understanding the kind of response to that, the life it takes on online. So, in a way, I think there's quite complex thinking that needs to be done about how we go about that. And we do that in the newsroom. I mean, you probably know, Nick referenced it in the report. Last year, we set up BBC Verify, which is, and it's great to see that it's cut through, and our own feedback is that it has cut through with audience as well, which is the sort of fact-checking unit we have. But it does more than fact-checking. It takes the images, it takes the video that come in, and really tries to sort of understand where has this come from, what's the provenance, can we geolocate things, all that information that you think might be very easy to integrate into the daily newsroom life, but actually the climate we're in means that it's very important that there is a unit that does that. And it goes beyond fact-checking. There's a unit within Verify that's pretty much dedicated to mis- and disinformation, and that's where, Mariana Spring is in that, and through the election, she's done a lot of work, quite similar, actually, to some of the work Channel 4 done. She's run kind of undercover voters and, kind of created a series of personas to see how they're being influenced, and we've reported on that through the election. And through that prism, we're able to kind of show audiences, how all these actors, how all these influences, these bots are kind of trying to get your vote, essentially. But there's another much more important level to that for us, which is really important for us as part of our public service remit, which is just able to steer the audience through the very basic facts. How do you navigate, what are the manifestos, having clear manifesto guides, having, what is, we ran this Your Voice, Your Vote project this time, the first time that we've done, and we got lots of really interesting questions in, and issues that people thought were important, which was kind of not always what we might have thought was important, and what politicians, not necessarily what the politicians were talking about. And we understood that, that really illustrated to us the gap, some of the gaps that the report identifies. And we try to sort of populate that. So we talk about things like housing, which came up as a really big issue for audiences, and think, well, what do you need to know about housing? And so, by situating the audience and understanding the basic facts about the most basic kind of big political issues, that's for us is our starting point.
And it's interesting, isn't it, in the context of Rasmus and Nick's report about what the public are looking for from news media, and relevant information, explainers, in-depth pieces are obviously valuable. And that, Jack, is kind of where you come in, because a big part of TLDR is about explaining the world around you. How are you thinking about doing that when, your content, your news product is available often on platforms where there are some issues with dis and misinformation?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. The platforms, our main platform is YouTube, obviously, which comparative to other platforms, fortunately, the audience feel more able to recognize what is true and what isn't. But irrespective of that, you're right, there's troubling content on every platform.
Yeah.
We tend to focus on what we're doing and how we do it, and focusing on doing the best reporting we can. And for us, especially as a brand that kind of has no reputation, and as a group of people that have essentially no reputation, it is about establishing who we are and being transparent through that. And there's obviously talk about transparency and that being demanded from audiences more generally, but I think especially younger audiences, and I think especially on social platforms, there's a real expectation of transparency. That's what you get from influencers. It's, well, in theory at least. You get that transparency, they look into their lives, and I think the audience appreciate the same from us. And we have regular features we do. Every year we publish a report and a video into how we make money, our exact revenue sources, how much money we make from different places. We also, every 2 weeks, in theory, release a video where we discuss everything we got wrong in the last 2 weeks. And we respond to every single video that got a like to dislike ratio below a certain point. And often we stand by them and say, we didn't really get anything wrong. It just was a contentious topic and sorry. But some of the time we did get something wrong. And it's being transparent and having that dialogue and the conversation with the audience that I think they really appreciate, and it does build that trust over time.
It's really interesting, isn't it? Because, of course, corrections has been part of the architecture of news media and newspapers for a very long time. But for a new news organisation like yours, you're doing it in a different way. So do you think are you giving provenance to where you've got things wrong, and you see that as a way of building trust with the audience?
I mean, I think so. I mean, obviously the stereotype with print media is that those kind of corrections get hidden on back pages and no one reads them. We put them in major videos that go up on the same platform as the content where the mistake was made.
Yeah.
Now, these are kind of, 20-minute podcast episodes where we're talking kind of in depth about journalism. They're not for everyone. The view count is a lot lower than the original videos, admittedly.
Yeah.
But the audience knows they're there. And I think even if they don't watch every episode, even if they don't need all the corrections, it's the accountability and the fact that we're doing it and the fact that we're open to do it. I think that's what builds the trust, even if you're not consuming the content.
That's really interesting. Just sticking on this misinformation, disinformation topic for a second. Matt, the FT is one of the world's most respected and reliable sources of information for the capital markets and for companies and so on and so forth. The risk of misinformation and disinformation in that space is absolutely huge, right? It's quantifiable. And, you know, we've read and we've seen how disinformation and misinformation networks are not just targeting political actors or media companies. They're also tackling and targeting companies. Mm-hmm. So within the FT, how are you thinking about being absolutely kind of, you know, copper bottom sure that the information when it comes to companies is not being affected by these kind of actors?
I mean, we're doing what we've always done. We
Yeah.
have to check everything. We have to, you know, we have fact checking and source checking.
Yeah.
Speaking to real people, you know, not taking flyers that we see, you know, rushing around the world on social media. We have to be rigorous in our journalism, where we always have been, and that hasn't really changed at all. I think it's slightly different for us to for Kathy and the BBC. I mean, we're not dealing with large amounts of daily news on video that can be manipulated. Yeah, we're you know, we're fairly distinct and niche in many ways news outlet, and we have a different model. We have a subscription model. The FT is not for everybody, but we have a large number of subscribers. I think 1.3 million people paying for the FT. So it's slightly different for us. But those standards of of integrity and quality and rigor are still the same and haven't changed at all.
So, I mean, let's stick on this, Matt, if I may, this topic, because it's an associated topic, which is AI, because as Kathy's dispatches program demonstrated, the capabilities with AI to create deep fakes and so on and so forth is becoming, you know, more and more sophisticated. Your editor, Rula Khalif, wrote a rather brilliant letter, actually, earlier this year that set out the FT's policy in respect to the use and adoption of AI across the title. She said that in the AI age, the FT will continue to be reported and written by humans. Can you tell me, as somebody really immersed in this space at the moment, what are you optimistic about in terms of the AI use in newsrooms? You've heard from Nick and Rasmus's report that there's a lot of trust issues around AI.
I mean, it's interesting. She actually wrote it a year ago. It was in May of 2023.
Forgive me. Yeah.
And I've been working on it with her and with other colleagues in the newsroom to find what are the most optimal uses of AI that we can come up with. And there's obviously anxiety in journalism and anxiety in news about, you know, am I reading something which was written by a human or written by a bot or written by an AI? She's made this commitment that all of our journalism will still be edited, will still be written by people, by journalists with all the kind of rigor that we spoke about. But AI tools can enhance the journalism that we're trying to produce. So we've got two strands of work that have been going on for several months now. We're trying to create a way to use AI with different models. We've worked with ChatGPT and with Anthropic to sort of mine our library and mine our archive of already published journalism. Much in the way if you're researching a story, you go back and if it's been in the FT, you know it's legit and you know it's subject to fact checking and quality standards and all those things. But to do things like timelines and to do things like bullet point summaries, and we're just trying to find the best use case, so that when a journalist is writing a piece of copy, if we need to summarize it quickly, or if we need to produce a quick timeline, we can do that, and we can use AI to do that. So we haven't rolled this out yet, but we're working on it and we're testing it. We've got a small test group that are doing that. And the second big strand of work is using AI to really dig deep into large unstructured data sets. Yeah. So data journalism, we've kind of led the way on that at the FT. We've done a lot of really big, important data analysis projects. And there are some data projects which are just too enormous. You know, if you have to read a cache of emails, of thousands of emails, or you've got a load of leaked filings or leaked documents, we should theoretically be able to use an AI to read it, to find signal and noise, and to find the tips that then lead to bigger stories. So we've got a small team working on that as well. So I'm generally pretty optimistic about it, and I think we are generally optimistic about it, despite the fact that there are all these attendant risks in, elsewhere in the sort of ecosystem of.
But it's interesting, isn't it? The use of AI as a tool to unearth
very powerful
insights or revelations that then could form investigative news pieces. If you think about the piece at the New York Times, right, about Trump's tax affairs, they were locked in a basement, I think, for kind of 6 months, literally manually going through all the information.
Well, we did this enormous investigation a few years ago into a German company called Wirecard, which we had
everything, and won many awards for it.
Yeah, we had thousands of emails, and we were going through them by hand, to try and find connections with it in these things. And if you've got a tool that can go in there for you, read it, and come back and say, actually, these people connect here.
So interesting. So this could be, Kathy, you want to come in, but this could be a golden age for investigative journalism?
Well, I can completely see how that, when you're dealing with large data dumps, AI could be very helpful. I keep on sort of thinking I'm missing a trick in my day-to-day job because I don't use ChatGPT, and I've trialed it personally a few times, and it's just nowhere near at the moment, and I know that will change very rapidly. But, what I'm doing, researching interviews every day, my bread and butter, rather than the sort of deeper investigative work, which is sort of more long-term. But, if I'm trying to craft an interview with a cabinet minister or whatever, the AI tools at the moment just are nowhere near, because I'm going to come at different angles with a very sort of unique Channel 4 perspective. It needs a human to sift those responses. And, I'm sure I'm going to be proved wrong in about 6 weeks, but I am better than the machine at the moment. But yeah, I'm sure it will be an assistive tool, but I just think in terms of getting a very, a different sort of human response and human perspective, that is crucial, and I think will remain crucial.
But it's so interesting, isn't it, this notion of the human in the loop? And when you look at the evidence out there at the moment about human versus the machine, often particularly in the creative space, Kathy, you're right, the human versus just the machine on its own will produce something that's more creative, smarter, more engaging.
It's more unpredictable.
But the human and the machine together versus the human on its own, that I think is going to be
the human's got to be the boss. And the machine's got to be assisting us.
So do you feel the same at the BBC, that human must be the boss?
I think we have said that there will always be a human in the loop, essentially. We're using that proverbial human.
Yeah.
And I think we've said there will always be sort of human oversight. I mean, we've got a range of kind of projects the BBC is looking at that are all internal facing at the moment, and they're all going to be, along the, adhering to kind of public values, trust, all those things that you'd expect from us. But a couple of them are quite interesting. And they're largely about sort of distribution. So the way that AI kind of research works in the BBC is there's intelligence being shared between all the departments, so HR, marketing, journalism. They're all sharing intelligence, which I think is quite an interesting way of kind of operating. And a couple of the really interesting projects, I mean, one, they're largely about efficiency, which is sort of internal experiments, like around translation.
Yeah.
We have 42 language services. You might see the immediate benefits of looking at how AI might work, with that. So I think that's one of the projects. Another one is looking at, reformatting. So, for example, live local radio, which may only be heard live and local. Can that be reformatted straight into text and, get a much wider distribution? So, I mean, none of that is external facing, but we're looking at kind of what those will do. But we've always said that there will be human oversight, there will be a human involved. I mean, I think that's important to audiences. That seems to be one of the things that the Root News report also really surfaces. They want to understand there is.
But not just a human involved. In my view, a human's got to be at
boss.
the heart of it. Yes. Our minds work in weird ways, and robots' minds work in different weird ways, but not in a weird way that I want all the time.
Well, the robots, the generative AI is a predictive tool, right? It's just a sophisticated way of doing predictive text.
No,
I mean, I think that what's interesting is reformatting. I mean, I've seen this myself with text-based reports that you can run through Gemini and then create different types of formats, including things like podcasts. So I think as a sort of creative tool, you can kind of, you can see it. But Jack, in your world and in the journalism you're producing, are you using AI tools at the moment?
Our approach is probably weirdly similar to all of these guys in that we are also kind of skeptical. I agree with Kathy about its kind of usefulness. We use it in specific use cases.
Yeah.
Again, human journalists are central to all of it. We're really not using it that much at the moment just because we don't have the capability and the kind of confidence to verify what's being said. I also think one of the unique things that we do is that we really select the stories we decide to speak about. We have a really curated approach to news. We release 15 videos a week, maybe, which for a YouTuber is quite a lot, but for a newsroom is like barely 15 minutes. So our audience has learned that we have maybe a similar taste to them in news, or they at least trust our kind of curation. And I think that is the most powerful tool we have. And if we begin handing that over to AI and kind of making that as kind of technological systematized thing rather than a human curation process, you lose that. And I think reports like this one and others that we've been part of really suggest that one of the things that's lacking in digital news is people don't have that kind of community and those people around them that they trust that can recommend news sources.
Yep.
That's what a lot of people are looking for, is they want a proxy for a friend or a sibling or whoever that is sending them news. And we kind of act as that in some ways, and that's not something we're willing to give up.
It's quite interesting because we've seen that for a long time in our longitudinal trust survey, that the peer-to-peer relationship is the most trusted.
Yeah.
Often sort of employee to employee or neighbours or friendship
People
groups,
search
as you
for
say.
connection on the internet, right? So I mean, that's the most significant, thing. And I think, taking on the AI discussion, I think the thing that we kind of really give, as Channel 4, BBC, FT, the expertise that our journalists, our correspondents bring, I mean, nothing's going to kind of replace that. I mean, that's our USP for us. What Quentin Somerville going to Myanmar.
Yes. Yeah, you can't send an AI bot there.
But there
very
are
easily
benefits of
at the
scale,
moment.
right?
Yeah.
There are benefits at scale. But
Yeah. Well, I remember this reporting in Northern Ireland in the 1990s when to get to the heart of a story, it's human to human, right? Particularly.
And, it's about contacts and sources built up over
exactly right.
decades. You can't replace that.
No.
So it sounds like the last gasp of the
Yes.
last.
Yeah.
Well, back in our day.
Matt, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I was just going to say that I think most, if not all news organisations are looking at this stuff, right?
Yeah.
Experimenting, but I think being transparent about it is essential.
Yeah.
And we've tried to do that. We're not at the stage yet where we're putting anything in front of readers that has been even assisted by AI. But what's become clear is that journalists are kind of well placed to do this, right?
Yeah.
Because with the tools that we're using, the tools that we're building, prompt engineering, which is kind of quite a scary sounding term, which you think involves coding and software and sort of people who know lots about computers, is actually prompt editing, right? It's writing the prompt into an AI in a clear way to get an output. And if it's looking at our archive and we can write, journalists are well placed to do that and to write clear copy and to write clear instructions to get good outcomes.
Well, I'm getting some clear instructions now,
Oh,
which is that I should have some audience questions.
Oh, good, right.
So there we are. Any questions from the audience? Joe.
Thank you. During his presentation, Nick mentioned, whilst he was talking about how interest in news is dropping, about how it might be down to the definition of news changing. So I'm wondering if any of you think that the definition of news is changing and how you think it's changing. And Jack, in particular, you were talking about the curation of news there, which all news organisations do. Is the curation of news changing the definition of news?
Jack, do you want to answer that?
It certainly could. I'd argue that we are maybe the most boring example of trying to change it, in that when you look at the report in more detail and when you look at kind of the way that news is changing and the topics that focuses are changing to, especially among younger people, we are kind of sticking with the very traditional stuff. We're still talking about elections, geopolitics, that kind of thing. So I think there certainly is the ability to make that shift, and I think various news organizations are doing it well, and especially tailoring for young audiences, but we aren't doing that. We're just doing the normal stuff.
I think it's, and I would say this, but I think it's really important that if the definition of news changes, that there's a crucial role now more than ever for impartial public service broadcasting. And I know impartiality has become sort of weaponized as a word, but I think in this age of fake news and misinformation, and let's see how the new government deals in law with misinformation, because that's unfinished business. Our kids are not watching Channel 4 News, and they're not watching the BBC. They're getting a lot of their news. My 15-year-old gets a lot of her news from TikTok. And I just think it's hugely important as a bulwark against fake news that BBC, Channel 4, FT, obviously, different type of public service, but that those kind of organisations are well funded and well resourced and well supported in regulation.
3 years ago, BBC Digital reorganised itself quite radically. And what we did, one of the departments we introduced, sort of the digital output split into 3. One of the key pillars was curation. And I think for a long time we've talked about broadening the agenda, and that doesn't mean departing at all from our very absolutely core public service news remit, but it's an understanding that people digest news, think about news, engage with it in different ways at different times and at different places, and kind of showcasing the huge, array of things that we, as the BBC and as BBC News, put out in front of audiences. Yeah. So, we have invested a lot in a weekend team, and we've been recruiting and expanding on the weekend, our weekend offer. And because we think people think about news differently at the weekends, so we have kind of slightly more in-depth pieces. We have, you might see our push alerts looking a little bit different. You might have got one about the death of Slim Shady a few weeks ago. And I think in a way it's creating the space for, you have a core, which is the update me, the user need. But you also have room for those other user needs to be surfaced in all the various platforms.
And that's why we're doing TikTok explainers as well, because we've got to go to where the eyeballs are and young eyeballs. And that doesn't mean that, just because we're on TikTok, we jettison our values. Our videos on TikTok, our explainers, will be just as rigorously checked, and they will have that impartiality at their core, but they're on TikTok, and they're they're done by younger, not done by me by and large, they're done by younger presenters, younger reporters in a much more, engaging style than the traditional 7 o'clock linear TV, which is still hugely important, by the way.
I was just going to say, I think it's partly cyclical, right? I think we think about the 4 years we've just had. I mean, just to this point about interest in news waning. We had this kind of global pandemic which touched the lives of everybody on the planet, and people voraciously consume the news. I mean, our traffic and our interest in what we were writing was greater than it's ever been at that point. And then we get out of that, and in the UK we have a political crisis and 3 prime ministers in 6 weeks and a dead monarch and a new king. There was a big, very heavy, very intense news cycle. The last 12 months I think have been a bit less exciting compared with that. But come November, if Donald Trump is in the White House and then starts dismantling the Department of Justice and locking up political opponents and sending federal troops into states to deport 11 million undocumented immigrants, people are going to be interested in the news. There's going to be stuff that will be happening, and the world will be watching that, and news organisations covering that will be at the forefront of it, I think.
Question there as well.
So in Nick's presentation, I think he touched on something about BBC Verify and the fact that it was sort of preaching to the converted to a degree. And in actual fact, in some respects, it was having the opposite effect amongst people that already distrust it by strengthening that distrust. So my question was the extent to which you recognise that as an issue and what you can do about it, I guess.
It's a really, really good question. And I think it's a clear risk, because there's this real sense in which we think journalists have their own idea about what trust and transparency is, which is, strong ethical standards, treating our sources fairly, being totally transparent about what we do. We stick to that really rigorously and checking everything, and we show that all with Verify, and we do our very best with it. And then you kind of also perhaps feel that for some perhaps large sections of the audience out there, that in a sense, what they're talking about is something different. What they mean by trust is something different. It's this, ideas about motivation, about political bias, and all that. So, I think we do recognise. I think what Verify does is it's a maximalist approach to trust and transparency and fact checking, and that's all we can do there. And we can go out and talk about it, and we can show our workings. In terms of how do you address the people who are probably going to sort of see you in a certain way anyway, I think that goes back to our core news values, right? It goes back to what is our agenda? Are we, do we cover all sorts of things? Do we treat everybody fairly, and do we show that up? And I think that's, and I think there's nothing much more we can do around that. But I think it is a gap that we kind of, that is recognised in the newsroom. We understand that. We have conversations about, different audiences, looking at our output. If you're looking at it from this perspective, how are you going to see that conversations are there? And all we can do is be as transparent about that in our actual core reporting.
Other questions?
On the news avoidance piece, one of the things that came out was, a need as well for a little bit of optimism. And in particular, I'm thinking about news about climate change. I know from my own children and the children of friends, there's a lot of despair and a feeling of powerlessness about climate change. I just wanted to ask what you thought your role was in perhaps injecting some optimism and solutions into that debate.
Matt, do you want to take that first? Because often the optimism and solutions comes from clean tech, innovation, new kind of breakthroughs, which often come through initially through business reporting. So how's the FT thinking about this?
Well, we cover climate change pretty assiduously. We've got an online splash this morning is about the world's largest oil company, Saudi Aramco, is investing in new combustion engine tech. So it's making a big bet on the future of the car, which is not great news for anyone who's worried about emissions and about climate change. I've never thought personally that it's the media's job to be kind of positive or optimistic about anything. I think readers like positive stories if there are any, and if we get them, then we report them. I think we splashed it's probably a couple of years ago now, but there was a story on, I think, a majority of Britain's power now coming from renewable sources, which is kind of a bit of a landmark moment. So we will cover that, and we'll write about it when we can. I just think we have to cover this stuff and make it front of people's minds.
All I'd say is that we do try consciously to bring in sort of art stories and, stories that are nothing to do with the climate crisis, wars, and that's engaging interviews and, fascinating cultural phenomena. And I think that's how we bring uplift.
I think it was, Joe, it was over 10 years ago, wasn't it? Martin Lewis, not the money guy, but the former BBC presenter and his positive news initiative, which is one of those things, people ask for these things, but it turns out not to be massively popular.
It's the phrase, if it bleeds, it leads, right?
They don't want it,
which sort of is the governance help.
Okay, last question from me, because we do need to wrap up. So I was really struck by the fact that just 8% of people in this country are prepared to pay for news. And then when you look at your point, you've raised it, Matt, as well, about news interest, is 38%, is halved since 2015, plus this news avoidance piece as well. Just as the last question for all of you, as we move forward, how are you thinking about tackling this, building much greater depths of engagement and interest in news media with audiences? Maybe, Jack, can we come to you last? Because you're representing a kind of new generation. So, absolutely. Samantha.
As someone from the BBC would say that a lot of people do pay for us because through the licensing.
Yeah, indeed. Yes. Yeah.
Whether we like it or not.
Yes. Yeah. So that's something that might kind of affect the UK figure perhaps to some extent, but I think people do pay. But at the same time, I think, the news avoidance piece is something that we think about a lot. And I think, again, it goes back to the sort of the broadening of the agenda, to the curation, and the context is something that we're addressing through this we've just launched something called, it's been a soft launch. You might notice a different sort of format on the front page called In Depth. And that's where we're really purposefully setting aside, here's the time to think, the time to engage, the time to move away from the kind of update me and time to reflect. Those kinds of pieces, we're getting more of that onto the site. Mm-hmm. And we're hoping that kind of offers audiences, a way to sort of, see increased value beyond the sort of the noise of the constant updates.
So to Kathy and Matt, thinking about new audiences who are prepared to pay for the FT, new eyeballs for Channel 4 News, how are you going to be doing journalism differently, do you think?
I mean, we're funded by advertising, unlike the BBC, of course. Our policy is to get to every platform we can, so that, I mentioned TikTok earlier, but, YouTube, clearly, again, with the sort of downgrading of Newsnight, we're just about the only outlet doing big in-depth films from, Myanmar, for example, and putting them out on YouTube. So that's bringing a new audience to our particular brand of journalism. So I would say that's how we engage people, is to go where people are looking for news.
Matt?
I agree. We have to be where the audiences are, and if they're on TikTok and YouTube, we're on those platforms as well. Difficulty for us is we can go there and reach them, and we can engage them. I mean, we do lots of long-form films of about 30 minutes long. Our Brexit film, which we came out last year, which I think 6 or 7 million people watched, was one of the big hits we've had. But getting those people to then come and subscribe to the FT is hard, so we can be in front of people and show them our journalism.
Yeah.
But I would just say as well that I think, again, without being too sort of happy-clappy about it, and I'm generally optimistic, because there hasn't been much innovation in this space in the UK in terms of getting young readers to pay for news. And there's been loads in the US. Yeah. Think about Axios and Politico and Semaphore and Puck and all these kind of new startups. And in the UK, I think still the traditional publishers are sort of putting a version of their newspaper online and then saying, well, they'll pay for it. And that's all you can
I think that's true. Internationally, though, we are commercially funded. Internationally, we take advertising on our sites, on the app, and we have kind of very similar things to think about,
We've got the cushion of the license.
Well, this is probably for another debate. Jack, 3 million on your followers or for TLDR News, from nothing to 3 million in how many years?
6.
6 years, incredible. How do you go from 3 to 6 million, and what are the lessons for the traditional media here?
I think when we're looking at news avoidance, we see the explainer as a real kind of great way of getting around that. I think a lot of the news avoidance comes from feeling overwhelmed, from feeling out of control with news, and then just shutting down with it. And I think our curation and our explainer technique allows us to kind of make people feel more in control and more aware of what's happening, and therefore more comfortable with engaging more. And I mean, we're able to build a really clear and really powerful relationship with our audience, which then allows us to kind of fund the business. In fact, we've recently launched a print magazine that we publish 3 times a year that is probably our most profitable business venture at the moment. So we're kind of going backwards, weirdly. So it certainly is possible to fund digital businesses.
With that bombshell then, which is there's money in print, why don't we leave it there? Thank you very much to the panel. Brilliant. Great, thank you.